Good morning. My name is Erica Shein. I'm the Managing Director of IFES' Center for Applied Research and Learning and our Democratic Resilience Lab. For the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about trust in elections and what we can learn about recent initiatives to build it, to sustain it, to restore it. We're all cognizant of the fact that we get very excited about our topic. If anyone here is speaking too rapidly, feel free, give us a wave. We'll try and slow down. While the spotlight is on the United States this week, this is an essential conversation for all of us. Globally, election officials have the difficult task of protecting a fundamental, arguably the fundamental democratic process, and convincing the public that election outcomes are worthy of their trust. Fundamentally, and particularly in our modern age of seamless, borderless, and nearly instantaneous information sharing, discrediting the electoral process is a much easier task than explaining how it works. This is a lesson many of us learned on the playground. It can be so much easier to criticize than to construct, to attack than to defend. And narratives attacking our elections, and as Anne Applebaum mentioned earlier, that use the language of chaos to sow distrust in democracy. This poses acute risks to trust and confidence. Closing this trust deficit requires coordinated action to bolster individual or personal trust in a country's leaders, procedural trust in the election process, and institutional trust, including in election management bodies tasked with delivering elections. We have so many tools at our disposal, like messaging campaigns and pre-bunking by election officials and community leaders, educational outreach to media and journalists, or risk-limiting audits conducted prior to certification of final election results. Bolstering trust in elections is a daunting task, and democracy's defenders have an important choice. We can view this task as just insurmountable, or we can marshal the imagination to take it on. The speakers joining me today have chosen this latter path and have a lot to share with us. Thad Kousser is professor of political science, co-director of the Yankelovich Center for Social Science Research at the University of California, San Diego. Professor Kousser studies American politics, voting reforms, direct democracy, and trust in elections. And then Mark de la Iglesia is the director for U.S. democracy at Freedom House, where he leads the organization's nonpartisan efforts to protect and strengthen American democracy. Mark has 2 decades of experience in the U.S. and internationally, including on important initiatives to build trust in American elections. I'd encourage you to go to the app and submit any questions you have during this session, and we'll take a few at the end as time allows. We're going to start with Thad, who's going to quickly set the scene for us with some data about trends in public trust in elections in the United States.
Great, thanks so much, Erica. And let's bring up the slides, please. What I want to start is by showing you some data, all taken from surveys that are representative of the entire US population, that look at the landscape of public confidence in the accuracy and integrity of elections. Now, this landscape changes over time. That's one of the first lessons of these data. And it changes often in response to who wins and who loses an election. So if you look at this trend, this is data from monthly surveys beginning 4 years ago, just before the 2020 election. That's the data you see on one side. And it goes all the way through a survey that the Yankelovich Center at UC San Diego did just after the 2022 midterms ended with the Republicans getting control of the House. And what you see here is in blue. That's the color that we use to represent the Democratic Party often in the United States. That blue line is the percentage of Democrats who said, generally speaking, I trust the US electoral system. In red we see Republicans. Red is usually the color used for Republicans in the United States, and in green, we see where independents were. And what you see is if we were having this conversation 4 years ago, we'd talk about Republicans being strongly trusting in elections. They had just won the last presidential election, and Democrats and independents not trusting. That flipped with the results of the 2020 election, with the election of Joe Biden, and especially the Stop the Steal movement and everything we saw in January 6th and thereafter. Republican trust and independent trust became very low, and we saw this gap between the two parties. After the 2022 election, when the Republicans won control of the House, many people thought Republicans would regain trust in elections. What we saw is that Democrats and independents regained their trust in elections, but Republican trust remained low, possibly because you were still hearing so many messages on social media, as Erica talked about, and from the top leaders of the Republican Party raising skepticism, unfounded, about the elections. I want to give you a little bit of a snapshot of where we are and what the long-time trend has been. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is data taken not every month, but every 4 years from the Gallup organization that looks at the percentage of people, again, with Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, and independents in the dotted line, showing you that back in 2008, there wasn't a big partisan divide. Each party was equally trusting of elections. And really, if you go every 4 years, that divide has just grown and grown, and right now, on the eve of the 2024 election, we have the widest gap between the two parties over trust in elections that we've ever seen before.
All right, thanks, Thad. So looking at this data, looking at this decline in trust among some segments of the population, we're just less than a day out from Election Day, if you hadn't noticed. So, Mark, a question for you. What are you seeing as the main risks to democracy resulting from the data, or from what we're seeing in the data?
Absolutely. Well, speaking of the data, can I ask that we keep that last slide up there, because I think it will be useful for us to reference, thank you, throughout the conversation. Before I get into the threats, I want to talk about my perspective on what I think is driving that partisan trust gap, at least in these last 4 years, where you can see in the slides here, the gap has really expanded. And in the previous slide, you also saw that after the 2022 midterm elections, when Republicans regained control of the House of Representatives, normally based on this consistent finding across contexts that voters tend to trust the outcome of elections more when their party won, you might think that Republicans would have trusted elections a bit more after that, since their party won the House back. But instead, distrust amongst Republicans only increased. And you can see in this slide how substantially that gap has become in the past 4 years. And I think there are potentially a variety of contributions, but from my perspective, the absolute avalanche of false and misleading information and narratives coming from political leadership, Republican Party political leadership, and specifically from former President Trump and his allies, is an obvious and main contributing factor to this. There's obviously Trump's continued maintaining that the 2020 election was stolen, which of course has been disproven in scores of court cases and investigations. But also there's this narrative, there's this forward-looking narrative about risks of fraud, of supposed fraud in the upcoming US elections. And you see more than just Trump and his most direct allies sort of courting these kinds of lines of misleading narrative. So in the 2020 election, one of the most, there were a wide variety of sort of conspiratorial claims that were made. But one of the main lines was that somehow mail voting was at risk of fraud. And that captured people's imagination and attention because it was during COVID and you had so much more use of mail voting from jurisdictions that previously hadn't used it. So there was some kind of logic to it in people's minds, despite really there being no substance to it ultimately, given the security measures that were in place. And this cycle, as we've heard discussed earlier today, this idea of non-US citizens voting has become one of these sort of boogaboos amongst the Republican Party. And again, there is little to no evidence that this is actually any sort of a risk of fraud. The actual number of non-US citizens who have ever been shown to have voted is just so tiny, it's not even worth mentioning in terms of anything that could sway an election. But that hasn't stopped Republican leaders in state legislatures, governors, secretaries of state from sort of raising this issue and citing the fact that there are registration challenges where you have non-citizens seemingly having entered the registration rolls, but in fact when those sort of issues are actually audited, you end up finding that it's a result of them having most of it is a result of them having previously not been citizens and since becoming citizens. And so in Alabama, for example, the Secretary of State there essentially purged 3,000 voters because it looked on their records like they were non-citizens. And when they then audited that, they found that 2/3 of them, or nearly 2/3 of them, were eligible voters. Now, thankfully, that relatively last-minute change was reversed by a court, but you can get a sense of some of the lines of misinformation that are out there heading into this election. And I guess what I argue is, because we have such a polarized political environment in this country, people, and a nationalized, an increasingly nationalized political environment. So people are paying less attention to local and state politics and more to the national narratives. And when you have this national narrative and the leading candidate from the Republican Party and his allies have been pushing forward this argument that our elections can't be trusted, it's, to my mind, findings like this aren't surprising. So what threats does this actually, or risks does it actually present? I mean, first, these false narratives can be used as pretexts for anti-democratic behavior. I just mentioned the sort of purges of suspected non-citizen voters that ends up potentially actually disenfranchising eligible voters. Now, I don't want to overstate this because I think the actual number of voters affected is relatively small, but you have seen a number of changes in the past 4 years, but particularly recently in some jurisdictions, citing this supposed problem with election security to pass more sort of access restricting voting policies in a number of Republican states in particular. Again, I don't want to overstate it because I think it can be overstated how much impact that will actually have on access, but it is a risk, and one has to raise the question, is that risk worth taking when it's actually not founded on a real threat to security that's being cited as the pretext? I think much more concerning is this sort of risk of using this false narrative about fraud for post-election meddling by partisan actors in the certification process of the vote or other attempts to sort of undermine the fair counting and certification of it. Again, I don't want to overstate this risk because our laws, both at the state level and at the federal level in the US, are quite strong in terms of requiring that certifiers of the election do their job as just a ministerial duty, that they have to rely on the counts that came from the election administrators and certify. But there are still some loopholes in the system, and as someone explained earlier, the Electoral Count Reform Act that passed in the Congress really closed a lot of these loopholes and made it more difficult to sort of meddle with election results after the fact in the certification process. But it still, as you heard, allows governors to make the final certification decision. I mean, one could imagine a sort of governor going rogue based on specious sort of claims of fraud and not certifying an election. So there is a risk out there still, but I think, to my mind, the more concerning risk is the sort of way in which these false narratives fuel kind of political intimidation efforts and raise the risk of political violence. So this is something we've already seen over the past 4 years. We've seen a significant upsurge in violent threats and even some violent actions against elections administrators themselves. This was unheard of in the United States before 2020. Sure, we've had a long history of political violence where actual political actors themselves and political leaders may have gotten targeted, but to target the sort of workaday administrators of elections was something new, and surveys of these administrators have shown they've faced a significant upsurge in threats over the past 4 years. Of course, January 6th, 4 years ago, was an example of anti-democratic behavior and political violence that was fueled by these very false narratives. And I think in the coming days and weeks, these kinds of risks continue. I'm personally not as concerned about tomorrow, the election day itself, and more concerned about the kinds of things that could emerge in the days and weeks afterwards as the different stages of the process proceed. As you've heard, there are these different stages at the county, state, and ultimately federal level to certify the election. And there, if we had a scenario like 2020 where Trump loses and he's claiming fraud, which all indications are that he will do so, you could see actors motivated by that carrying out acts of political intimidation and violence. So that's what I'm most concerned about. But I want to pivot to how we can build trust, and I think Thad's going to have the most to say about this because he's been doing amazing research, particularly on the role of elections officials and what they can do. But first I'll just say it's not easy in the US to build trust. It's not easy in any context, as you all know. But I think we have some structural issues, maybe compared to some of your contexts, that make it a bit more difficult. First, as you've heard, we have no single national elections management body and no totally uniform set of rules and laws about election security and access as you do in other places. So I'm thinking of Mexico, for example, which I don't know if we have any Mexicans in the room, but and call me out if I'm getting this wrong, but my understanding is, after the 2006 election, you all had some major controversy and concern about the election system there, and you invested substantially in INE, the elections management body there. And there is, despite having a federal system like the US, they have a single national elections management body. They invested heavily in their independence, autonomy, and funding, and were able to communicate and build more public support and understanding of the core, why the system can be trusted. And to this day, even though there has been efforts to sort of undermine INE recently, it's still one of the most trusted institutions in the country. We don't have anything like that here in the US. Also, there's the issue that elections are administered, in many cases, at least overseen by partisan elected officials. We manage to still, they manage to do their jobs mostly in a very nonpartisan way, but it does create potentially in these moments when you have partisan elected officials driving concerns about fraud, it can sort of add to a sense of distrust amongst people. But I want to focus just briefly in the end of my remarks here on the important role that Republicans actually are playing in this moment in pushing back on this narrative within their own party and trying to build trust in elections. And here, maybe the partisan nature of elections officials can be somewhat of an advantage because you have elections officials who are elected and have the Republican Party brand behind their name, but they're experts in how elections actually work. And many of these have started speaking up in the past 4 years, and increasingly as we head into this election, to sort of debunk all the false and misleading narratives about how our elections work here. I've had the privilege of working with some of these folks. There's a network coordinated by R Street Institute and the SNF Agora initiative at Johns Hopkins that has a bunch of these Republican elections officials speaking out about why elections, not only in their jurisdictions, but across the country, can be trusted. And there is a core set of shared security measures that every jurisdiction across the country includes. But it's difficult for any one person to speak out about those when these elections administrators are focused on their own jurisdictions. So we've been working with them to communicate more publicly about that. You'll see an op-ed if you look at the Wall Street Journal today, where Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, and Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson of Utah, both Republicans, are talking, like debunking a lot of the mis and disinformation out there and talking about why elections can be trusted. And these folks are playing an incredibly important role because they give a permission structure, in a way, for fellow partisans, for fellow Republicans to say, okay, I can still go along with my party, I can even vote for Trump, but I don't have to believe that our elections can't be trusted. So that gives me hope. I'm happy to speak with some of you after this about what's going on there. Let me wrap up there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. We're going to go back to Thad now. And as Mark alluded to, Thad has been doing some really cool, really innovative research on kind of effective messaging for trust and confidence building, and especially messaging by election officials. So I think it'll be, it's testing that's been done in the US, and I think it'll be really interesting for all of us in the room.
Great, thanks so much. And let's bring up the slides again. So Mark laid out all of the challenges that the erosion of trust in elections creates. And election officials across the country are fighting back against these challenges with a lot of really innovative and energetic solutions. And so I want to talk about the research that this team of scholars at many universities, including the University of California, Yale, and the University of Southern California. I'm part of a team where we're working to support these people who Josh in our first panel today called the heroes of democracy. And they are heroes, and their job has changed radically since 2020. So the job of an election official used to be to run a trustworthy election, right? To protect and make sure they were accessible, to make sure that ballots were accurately counted, that they were protected in the process, and that they were audited in a fair way. Now their job is to continue to run a trustworthy election, but also to work proactively to get people to trust the elections. And that happened really after 2020. So that picture you see here on the left is Maricopa County. This is the second largest elections jurisdiction in the United States. It includes Phoenix, and it's been the center of election controversies in 2020 and in 2022. The elections there are run by, as Mark said, a Republican elected official, Stephen Richer, who's pictured right next to it, smiling. And so that picture you see with the Trump flag, that was outside of the vote counting facility in Maricopa County. It was essentially a camp out, a large demonstration of the Stop the Steal movement. And so what Stephen Richer has done with that election facility is open up the doors many afternoons for public tours of his office, where he takes people through and in a transparent way shows them all the protections on elections. Other officials like Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson have been out there on social media. She had a tweet last week that was seen by 33 million people responding to some of Elon Musk's unfounded claims about election fraud. So election officials are doing new things. And what we're trying to do at the Yankelovich Center for Social Science Research, working in partnership with MIT and funded by the Election Trust Initiative, is provide data that can help inform their efforts by showing which of these things is working, what doesn't work, and what works best, and putting that data in their hands. So what are some of the things that they're trying? Well, during the last election cycle in 2022, we partnered with 4 election officials. The elections directors, the civil servants who really run elections in Colorado and Texas, with the deputy director in Georgia, so under Brad Raffensperger's office, and with the registrar of Los Angeles County, which is the biggest electoral jurisdiction in the United States. And we asked them all, okay, we can run surveys of your voters as well as national surveys. What do you want to ask about what they trust and don't trust elections? So they helped us write surveys, but we also asked, what are you trying to do proactively? And the thing that in 2020 they were all doing is that they were creating videos explaining the protections on the vote, explaining who election officials were, explaining what they did to keep your votes secure. They were posting these on social media. Some of them had money to put them out there on television and through other digital media, and they wanted to find out whether they worked or not. So what we did was what's called a survey experiment, which works in a really simple way, where if we survey 3,000 people in the country, we randomly, by a flip of the coin, 1,000 of them will watch one of these videos. 1,000 of them will watch a different video, and 1,000 of them will watch a video that has nothing to do with elections. And so what we showed was an insurance commission. Let me show you what a couple of these videos look like, what election officials are doing. The first one that I want to show you comes from Virginia, a state that many of you will be visiting and looking at tomorrow. So if we could play that first video. Thank you.
The founding story of this great country is also the story of Virginia, because the American ideals we cherish today were born right here. So democracy is more than just our way of life. It's the grand experiment we'll do everything we can to defend. At the Virginia Department of Elections, we believe the integrity of our democracy is bound by the integrity of our elections. Protecting our electoral process is what drives us. Defending against fraud and intrusion while ensuring that every vote is counted and every voice is heard. Because for Virginian, defending democracy through safe and secure elections isn't just patriotic, it's personal.
All right. So that's sort of a big Hollywood production with election officials like you as the stars, designed to appeal to our emotions and make us associate elections with patriotism and trust them. And you might be thinking, well, that's nice if you have a multi-million-dollar budget and a big Hollywood producer, but what if I can just produce something really simple that just explains some of the facts and some of the information? And so that's what Maricopa County in Arizona did with this video. So if you could play the next fill in the blanks video, please.
Hey everyone, Phil the Ballot here.
In Arizona, voters use paper ballots to cast their votes. The tabulators are the machines that the Maricopa County Elections Department uses to count those ballots. Before and after every election, our tabulation equipment is tested to make sure your vote is accurately counted. After the election, political parties also do a hand count audit of the results. These are the machines that count early and vetted provisional ballots. And these are the machines you see at the voting locations that count election day ballots. None of the tabulation equipment is connected to the internet. You can see the visible wires here that show the tabulation equipment at our headquarters is routed directly to a secure server, not the internet.
Let's pause that video, please. So again, this doesn't take huge production values. And in fact, some groups, like the U.S. Electoral Assistance Commission that you saw Ben Hovland here before, they've produced videos that can be customized by different states to show the common protections, the things that Mark was saying we do everywhere across the United States. All right, so we showed these videos to a random selection of people, and we surveyed them afterwards about their levels of trust in elections, asking them, do you trust elections most or all the time? And the question is, do any of these things actually work? There's reason to believe that they work because most Americans don't know this information. They don't know who their election officials are, and they don't know all the steps that you saw in Maricopa about that they take to secure elections. And when we ask Americans who they trust to learn about whether their vote is protected, election officials appeared at the top of the list of people they trust, much more than media and much, much more than politicians in their own party. So we came into this optimistic that these things would work. But many election officials themselves didn't think that they would work whatsoever. So we talked to one elections director and we said, well, who do you think will change their mind the most? Who do you think will be most effective? And he said, I don't think anyone's going to change their mind. My mom doesn't trust elections. I talk to her all the time, and she said, I've heard all these things on the internet. I don't believe you, right? So they went in not thinking that these would work. what we found was that in state after state, if you could go to the next, there we go. Sorry, the slide back from that. There we go. Sorry. The results slide. What we found when we tested 2 messages in every state as well as these national messages was that they worked. Some of them brought really large increases in the percentage of people saying that they trusted elections, about half of that size of that gap between the 2 parties in some of our surveys. The Virginia and the Maricopa ones that we asked people whether it made them trust other states, they both worked and they both had equal effects. So you don't need Hollywood production values, you can just have a clear message. In the next year, when we took these results back to election officials, we learned 2 more things based on their questions. They said, well, what we really need is, because of the Electoral College, remember we heard in the first panel how really there are a few swing states that determine everything, and we need to trust elections that are run in those other states. What we found was that when we showed people ads about Texas, a Republican state, that could convince people in California, a mostly Democratic state, to trust Texas elections. And when we showed people ads about California, the Texans became more trusting of California elections. So these advertisements worked across state lines and across party lines, all of these informational videos. The last thing we did in 2003 responded to this conversation you heard earlier with Tim and Ben, who were talking about what's going to happen in the next few days, right? So in the next few days, we are going to see if the election is as nail-bitingly close as it was in 2016, as it was in 2020, we're going to see a lot of controversy because it's going to take a few days to count the ballots in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Arizona, and possibly Nevada, right? So how can you get people to trust elections? Well, in a paper that we just published last week, in Arizona, the last governor's race took 6 days for a winner to be determined. And so in our survey experiment, we showed some people, here was the person who won, and we told other people, here was the person who won, and it took 6 days to find out how much a delayed result reduced trust. Trust went down by about 9 percentage points when people heard that it took 6 days, right? But Arizona had created a video, a very simple video, it was called Accurate Results Take Time. So if we can play that video here. Okay, so that video wasn't expensive to produce, and all it did was just explain some of the reasons why it takes some time, because we're verifying signatures. People who had watched that video, their trust hardly declined at all. Their trust only went down 2 percentage points. So it was really that getting that factual information, even without big production values, that proved really effective in help inoculating people against this decline in trust that happens when election results take a while. All right, so I want to just briefly wrap up by letting you know that we are working across the country on a set of 6 studies, all partnering with election officials. People like, this is Tommy Gong, who's the registrar who runs elections, who's deputy registrar of a large area in the Bay Area of California near San Francisco. And Secretary of the State of Connecticut, Stephanie Thomas, who's pictured here. We're working with them to test their approaches. Tommy Gong is working on using sort of viral videos that look like influencer videos on TikTok or other areas. So they're trying to target young voters who have been especially open to misinformation. He wants to see if those things work. Secretary of State Thomas is helping us explore what videos resonate and what messages resonate with diverse communities, right? So even though a lot of the focus has been on Republicans who have seen a decline in trust, for a long time in America, we've seen a gap along racial and ethnic lines with Black Americans and Native Americans, especially, 2 groups that have faced disfranchisement historically and large obstacles to voting today. Their trust is significantly lower than it is for white Americans. And the question is, what messages and what laws are necessary to restore trust across these racial and ethnic gaps? So I'll just finish up where I started with Maricopa County. So in Maricopa County, Stephen Richer and his staff are giving tours. They've done, I think, about 50 of these tours of their election facility. They show people everything. It's a 2-hour experience that they call the golden ticket, and they show you everything about how they keep votes safe. When you walk into the tour, you use your phone, you hit that QR code, you take a survey on trust. When you walk out of the tour, you take another survey, and it all goes back. We have now collected almost 500 people's surveys, and what we found was that people increased trust dramatically, and it was especially Republicans who began with the lowest levels of trust who walked out of that tour much closer to where Democrats were when they walked in. So all of this work that the heroes of American democracy, these election officials across the country are doing to restore trust is having an effect, and I'd be more than happy to chat with you about this research or about these innovative strategies after the talk.
Thank you, Thad. I found this extremely fascinating. I hope others did as well, and we look forward to seeing the results of this, of the surveys you have out in the field now and in upcoming days and weeks. This very authoritative clock on the stage here tells me that we have about 9 minutes left. So I'm hoping that's enough to fit in a couple questions. I have in front of me some great questions that were submitted in the app from the audience. And this first one, which could be potentially for either of you, someone was paying attention to the data in the slides at the beginning. And so based on the Gallup poll, they noted that only a slight majority of independent voters expressed confidence in the U.S. election process. So how specifically can election officials or others build trust among those independent voters, especially given that they fall potentially all along the political spectrum? Anybody want to jump in?
I mean, I'd be inclined to think that the kind of work that Thad is testing, a heavy emphasis on putting elections officials themselves out there as the experts, and they're the ones that have been shown generally to have most trust on these topics in overall surveys of different types of communicators about election trust out front, because independents presumably are less likely to be swayed by the more partisan appeals. So that would be my kind of inclination about the best way to approach that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this really perceptive question highlights that there are a lot of people who are open to convincing. And I think independents are a group that's open to persuasion and convincing about whether they should trust elections. And one of the things that we found now in one of our studies from 2003 and also in a study we did this summer is that Republicans and independents move more in their trust because they start out with lower baseline levels of trust. And so a lot of this messaging is moving both of those two groups towards higher confidence in U.S. elections.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, and this one I think is specifically for Mark, because the person is asking about kind of Freedom House's work, and notes that freedom of expression is also crucial to trust in elections. And is this something, Freedom House, that you're tracking? Have you noticed anything about freedom of expression, whether it's gone up, down, or otherwise during this kind of election period?
You know, in our tracking, we're best known for our Freedom in the World report, which sort of assesses 200 plus countries and territories around the world for their degree of respect for political rights and civil liberties in their country. And as you may know, the US has declined significantly on those rankings, that index, I should say, over the past decade and a half. So we've gone from a 94 out of 100 to an 83 out of 100. Interestingly, I don't think any of that decline has been as a result of threats to freedom of expression. Now, this is a much longer kind of debate. We've had we have a very strong legal set of protections for freedom of expression here in the United States, stronger than really any other democracy in the world. And I think there's a debate to be had about whether there's more of a balance to be struck about ways that you can regulate sort of harmful lies in the public sphere that we could get into. the very lines of sort of false and misleading fraud narratives I talked about earlier, there has been some accountability around that, and it's been through defamation law in the United States, where individuals can claim that they were their public reputation was meaningfully harmed as a result of these false and misleading narratives. You may be aware of the Fox News settlement to the tune of some $700 million for mischaracterizing one of the leading, was it Dominion? One of the leading elections software voting machine companies. And there's another defamation case settled against Rudy Giuliani for some of the defamation of workaday elections administrators in Georgia, claiming that they were doing nefarious things. So there is some accountability for the kind of really harmful, anti-democratic, I would argue, expression that takes place. But compared to many other countries, we don't have the same kinds of tools against that. And there's a lot of good reason for that. The larger conversation about whether there's more of a chilling around freedom of expression on certain topics in the United States, I think is kind of beyond the scope of this conversation. I'm really focused on the threats to elections themselves, and so I think our freedom of expression protections are quite strong in the US.
Great, thank you. In kind of our last moments that we have remaining, I wanted to turn to both of you, starting with that, and just, do you have any final thoughts for the group? Sort of either about what you're seeing, how you're feeling, or what they can kind of take away back when they go back to their home and their own jobs leading difficult election processes.
Yeah, thanks. Well, my guess is that everything that you're hearing about the United States is something that you deal with in your everyday life, with the challenges to trust in elections. Hopefully it's not quite as acute, and hopefully it doesn't involve the personal threats. But I know that getting people to trust elections and ensuring that they are trustworthy is a huge challenge all across the world. I think the two lessons that I take from the United States go back to that graph that we started with, where you saw trust going up or down, right? It's not a static thing that is locked in, where people are set in their ways about whether they think elections work or not. It's something that changes. It changes depending on whether their side wins or loses an election, depending on what leaders in their parties say. But it also can be restored, right, by highlighting everything that people like you do to ensure that elections are trustworthy and deserve the trust of the public.
Yeah, maybe I would just add one kind of angle on this that we didn't cover in this brief conversation, which is the role of the rule of law and independent judiciaries in arbitrating and adjudicating election disputes. So whereas I talked about our system of elected elections administration officials can raise questions of trust here, I do think we have a strong independent judiciary here in the United States. Now, even that has faced some declining trust in recent years, particularly with a perceived sort of politicization of the Supreme Court. But the fact is that the independent judiciary really held strong in 2020 and basically put the lie to all of these false narratives and claims about election fraud. So you may have heard the figure that over 60 disputes, over 60 cases that were launched by Trump and his allies in the wake of 2020 to claim election fraud were either dismissed or found to be false last time around. And appeals all the way up to the Supreme Court to claim fraud were roundly rejected. And so the independent judiciary and the rule of law really held. So this is less about how you as elections administrators can build trust in the very near term with your coming elections, but it's just a larger reflection on the importance of investing in the independence and the robustness of your independent judiciary, or whatever the body is that manages elections disputes. Just wanted to make sure that point was made. I'm sure you're very familiar with it.
On that very important point, I want to thank you both so much. It has been a pleasure to share the stage with you. I think I have the distinct honor of dismissing you all to lunch. Very well deserved. Thank you so much for your attention. Please take note of the app, listen for the music in the hall for when it's time to come back in your seats for the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your lunch. Our after lunch program will begin at 1 p.m.